So part of the reason that I joined the political YouTube sphere was that I want to bridge kind of these Indian roots that I have with the American political consciousness, because I think that there's a real problem with, especially within my communities, of very progressive non-residential Indians. So Indians who moved from India over here, who support Democrats and progressive policies and liberals here, but then go back and they're very much pro Modi and pro BJP. Because I'm from a privileged caste Hindu family. And that really bothers me. And I think it's time to understand that left politics includes building real global solidarity that includes every other country. And it's the other reason I got into it was that it's very easy because of that for me to care about Indian politics and what's going on. Because many of my family and friends are also Indian. And from there, inductively, I have the privilege of being able to say that I care about my country, and I also care about this country that's not really mine, but I have a stake in it. And from there, I can start building like a doctrine of foreign policy ethics. I think that's difficult for people who aren't necessarily from immigrant families, because it's weird because this is the one country that you've ever really known as home. There's no real links to other countries. And it's difficult to get outside of the border and start thinking about foreign policy. But all of that comes back to affect us, and it is extremely important. So it's very good to be in the know about what's going on in the world and to have opinions on it and to be understanding how we have an influence on that and what our responsibility is to the international discourse. So even if you're not South Asian or Hindu or Muslim, I strongly advise you to stick around for this last segment, because it's part of building an understanding that there's an entire world out there, and our actions here are the most powerful and far-reaching influence in what happens out there. And what happens out there comes back to hit us. And we've learned that in the past. It's time to start caring beyond our own borders. So this is the one more news story I'm going to do from the past couple weeks. There's two big news stories coming out of India these past couple of weeks, which is the Citizenship Amendment Bill, and also the court decision to uphold the building of the Ayodhya temple, the temple in Ayodhya where the Babri Masjid once stood, which was the mosque that was torn down in 1992. So the Citizenship Amendment Bill, in a nutshell, basically there are India's census is riddled with administrative problems because there's a lot of bureaucratic problems in the basic structures of Indian admin. So there's a lot of people living in, especially in Northeast India, undocumented because they have not been counted in the census in forever. And so what the Citizenship Amendment Bill does, or people call it CAB or CAB, what it does is it creates a path to citizenship for everyone living in India who has not yet been counted as a citizen. It gives them the ability to attain citizenship with one caveat. If that person identifies as a Muslim, they are not allowed to seek citizenship. It really baffles me. I really thought, I didn't, but I'd hoped that this would be the breaking point where people who insist that the Indian right is not Islamophobic would turn around and they would say, okay, you know what, I was wrong. And there are some centrists who have done that. But largely, what it was are people who insisted that they weren't Islamophobic essentially coming out and admitting they are. And they do it through various different kinds of rhetoric. They come out and say, you know, the world has so many different Muslim countries, why can't we have a Hindu nation? By the way, if this sounds familiar, it's because it's reflected by Richard Spencer and the white nationalist movement. Israel is a Jewish ethno-state, says renowned and now explicitly understood anti-Semite Richard Spencer. He says, Israel is an ethno-state, why can't we have our own? And this is a common talking point. And first off, it's the idea that one person having their own ethno-state justifies us having ours. I disagree with the concept of an ethno-state. I think that we need to have generally a society, a global society that moves towards generally abolishing borders, if not like legal borders, needs to move toward abolishing borders based on religion, race, ethnicity. So no, I don't agree with other countries being ethno-states. But secondarily, you're talking about a giant secular experiment in India that is being supplanted by a faction that has existed since before the country's founding. And so these are the facts of CAB, is that it provides a path to citizenship. If you're Muslim, you do not qualify. That is clear anti-Muslim legislation. 100%. And the rhetoric used to defend it always dances around the topic. One of the really disingenuous points is Hindu nationalists will hear you say a path to citizenship bill that excludes Muslims is not okay, is not just. And the Hindu nationalists will say to you, oh, so you're saying that undocumented immigrants shouldn't get a path to citizenship? And it's a clear, they're trying to attack you from the left. And it's a clear obfuscation. But it derails the narrative, right? So don't get thrown off. Do not let people push you down dialogue trees. The other narrative people will say is that, like, oh, your side was led by an Italian Christian, so why do you tell Hindus what to do with our country? Do not grant the premise that India is a Hindu nation. It is not. Pakistan was created as a Muslim nation out of fear of persecution from Hindus. India was not created as the Hindu nation. India was the default. Pakistan was a secession from that. India was a secular experiment. And whether or not that secular experiment would have been able to house Muslims without discrimination, that is a hypothetical that cannot be answered. But the whole point of the experiment was to create that safe haven that does not discriminate based on religious background. The history of Hindu nationalism is very much intertwined with the Pakistani liberation movement. And they're both formed in the same concept, which is two-nation theory. Two-nation theory was, I believe, initially penned by Muslim scholars who believed that Muslims could not continue to live in India. And then what the Hindu nationalists, of whom the Muslim scholars were afraid, they latched on to that rhetoric. And they said, see, like, we need to have two separate countries, because they wanted their own country. They wanted to kill Muslims too. But they knew that the first step was to establish India as a Hindu nation. It failed. It absolutely failed. India has a clear commitment to secularism that is administrated and executed extremely ineffectively and problematically. For example, India has separate civil codes based on religion. That is very problematic. What you need is a uniform, non-religious civil code that enforces the laws rigorously with Hindus as it does with Muslims or Christians or Jains or Sikhs. But the entire point of this bill is to shift the Overton window into an area in which we're talking about India as a Hindu nation. Do not let that happen. This is a secular country. Muslims have as much of a right, Indian Muslims have as much of a right to India as Indian Hindus, as Indian Christians. And people who immigrate to India as refugees, whether documented or undocumented, they all have the same right to apply for citizenship or status under the law. There is no religious litmus test. That is completely against the founding principles of India. So don't get bogged down in the bullshit. Don't get bogged down in the lies, the obfuscation, and the prevarication. CAB is designed to oppress Muslims. That is it. That is the bottom line. The second court decision, of course, was the Ayodhya temple, or the second story was the court decision to uphold the Ayodhya temple. And there's not much to talk about here. This is also kind of not necessarily the Supreme Court being overtly Islamophobic, but definitely enabling into a larger BJP agenda, which originates back to 1992. We're going to do a proper deep dive on the Sangh Parivar, which is the Hindu right movement, and how the RSS, which was the original far-right Hindu nationalist party, a member of whose was the extremist Nathuram Godse, who assassinated Mahatma Gandhi, and they essentially underwent a transformation into from militancy into right-wing politics, and they have an overarching family that includes terrorist organizations, paramilitary organizations, youth movements, youth indoctrination movements, and their political wing, which is the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which currently holds a majority in Indian Parliament. So definitely a powerful and very dangerous force. We'll get into them a little bit later, but it was their supporters and Hindu nationalists who in 1992 went to Ayodhya, which is a religious historical site for both Muslims and Hindus. Ayodhya was the in Indian mythology and Hindu mythology was the seat of one of the reincarnations of Vishnu, who is Rama, whom everyone has heard of, or anyone who's heard of any Hindu deities has heard of Ram. So Rama was said to have ruled over Ayodhya and to have been the prince of Ayodhya and then the king of Ayodhya. And so it holds a very special place to Hindus. And it's also the site of a very important Indian Muslim mosque, or was, the Babri Masjid. And the Babri Mosque was sitting on a place where Hindu nationalists thought it was disrespectful, because Hindus thought that they owned Ayodhya because of some mythological link that they had to it. So what these Hindu terrorists did was they went into Ayodhya, they demolished the Babri Mosque, and it caused riots all over the country. Like, myriads of people were killed. And those riots continued into the mid-90s. So religious conflict is, aplenty. Now that the BJP has its first absolute majority, in the past 6 years it has developed its first majority in Indian politics, they established essentially plans to build a temple, a Hindu temple, in Ayodhya, where the Babri Masjid was once built and once demolished. So once again, this fits into a very, very clear agenda on the part of the Hindu right, which is to redefine India as a Hindu nation, to get rid of Muslim monuments and replace them with Hindu monuments, to completely cut off any form of injection of Muslim population representation from the Northeast, where it's most common, and to redefine Northeastern Muslim identity as fundamentally non-Indian. And that's the beginning. Once that change goes through, they're going to turn to the Muslims we have in our country. And in India, they're going to turn to Muslims, and they're going to start taking away Muslim Indian identity domestically. This completely fits into the Hindu fascist narrative. This fits into any fascist narrative. Any tribalist fascist narrative continually oppresses further and further within its circle. And there's no endpoint to it. It can't succeed. It cannot survive. But it can destroy everyone around it and take everyone down with it. Because Hindu fascism, Hindu nationalism, ethnic nationalism, white fascism, all of these are ideologies based on exclusion. That is not what India was founded on. That is not what America was founded on. White and Hindu nationalism are diametrically opposed to the liberal values that we espouse. Just something to take away with. And don't get sucked into the bullshit. Understand, CAB is about oppressing Muslims. It's about keeping Muslims out. And it's about creating a diametric opposition between Muslim identity and Indian identity. And this is an opposition, a mutual exclusion that has never existed in the history of that country. And the court decision, deplorable, highly unfortunate, not necessarily Islamophobic on the court's part, but definitely fits into BJP's larger agenda. And these are things that should concern everyone, not just people who look like me.